Welcome back to Dead Good Book Reviews. I'm Judith and you're watching another episode of Overbooked, the series where I talk about every single book on my shelf because I don't have a dog to occupy my time, so I might as well do this. Today I am talking about a trilogy. I feel like I've been doing a lot of single books in this series, so it's nice to knock out 3 books all in one go. And this slightly fuzzy trilogy behind me is Aliette De Bodard's Dominion of the Fallen series. I will put the covers up later, don't worry. You'll see them in all of their glory. Before we start, some quick disclaimers. I did have a review copy of the 3rd book, as well as a review copy of one of the short stories that I think comes between books 1 and 2, but these 2 books I did buy with my hard-earned cash. Regardless of where they came from, nobody's paying me to talk about books and all opinions are my own. I'm also going to keep things spoiler-free for all 3 books, though if you do want to go in knowing absolutely nothing, this is your opportunity to click away now, because I'm going to get into the broad plot summary. I first encountered this series before I was even blogging, I think, and it must have been when I was at university. I can't remember what made me pick it up, but it must have been because House of Shattered Wings was the first book that I bought, and it came, not ever, but the first book that I bought, and it came out in 2015. And it then languished on my shelves for a couple of years until I started book blogging, and I was like, oh, I need books to blog about, and I have some that I've never read. Let's read them. This was before I had a conception of a TBR, really. The House of Binding Thorns followed in 2017, though I read that from the library probably a year or so later. And then The House of Sundering Flames came out in 2019, by which point I was buddied up enough with the publisher to be sent a review copy, which made me very, very happy indeed. This is an adult fantasy, sort of dystopian, but not in the way that you would normally think about it, series, and probably, thinking about it, one of the first adult fantasy series I really read while I was still reading a lot of YA. Aliette De Bodard is a Paris-based author who has written just oodles of stuff, a lot of it award-winning. I have read this series. I've also read In the Vanisher's Palace, which is a lovely Beauty and the Beast retelling. I've read her most recent is the novella Fireheart Tiger, which I would definitely recommend. That's well worth reading. Basically, she's written a lot and I would like to read more of it. Desperately need to get to her alternate Sherlock Holmes. That's like top of my list for when I'm next thinking about a book to buy. This series takes place in an alternate Paris in the aftermath of a war in heaven, a magical war. Paris is divided into houses which fight for dominance in the destroyed capital. The series as a whole follows various characters in various different houses and outside the houses as they struggle to survive this really cutthroat environment, especially since at the start of book 1, the threats begin to expand beyond what they'd previously known. Paris already wasn't a nice place to be, but oh boy does it get worse by the 3rd book. I really love the setting of this series. If Paris in the aftermath of a war in heaven doesn't get you excited, I don't know what will. This series made it onto my Halloween list for 2020, largely because the atmosphere in these books are so amazing and so many things take place in these really creepy settings that aren't quite haunted houses, but they have that feel to them. This is the kind of series where I just want somebody to make me an open world video game so I can just walk around the spaces because I can see it in my mind. I want to wander through it. One thing that this series does really well, which I always appreciate, is the contrast between different places, particularly when you're talking about very opulent places versus places of poverty. I think that contrast is handled really well. And equally, the contrast between different places where different cultures are prevalent is very, very well done. Don't want to spoil that for you though. I think it's because across the board, all of the settings are described so vividly that you really get a sense of the different locations, which helps you to contrast them in your mind. It comes more into play in the 2nd book, I think, but it's definitely something that stuck with me about this series. I have reread this series at least once, twice in some instances. Some books have had multiple rereads, and each time I get something new out of it, largely I think because each time I kind of pick a different character to follow and to care about. It's that kind of series where one perspective really carries you through the book and everyone else feels a bit external to that, and then you'll read it again and you'll go, oh no, I want to focus on this person, and then that person carries you through. But all of the characters are great. I really like the different voices of the characters, the different backgrounds that they have, and I also really appreciate all their different plot threads throughout the books. What I like is there's a lot of very different character development across the series. Everyone's on a very different journey and you get to see and experience those differences and how people can grow in very different ways. I think there's probably at least one character that everyone would enjoy. There is LGBT representation of different kinds in this book, including an MLM relationship. Having read some more of Aliette De Bodard's work outside of this series since I first read it, I can see that that's something that she always likes to include in her books, and you very much get a sense of how important that representation is in her writing. So if you're looking for an author who writes this kind of thing, who you can then go, let me go and read all of their other stuff, you can. When I think back on these books, They feel very distinct to me, which is interesting because it is following the same characters in the same setting. I suppose I more mean that they're quite contained as opposed to feeling like one narrative spread across 3 books. I don't know if that was just because I read them quite separately the first time I read them, or whether it genuinely is kind of 3 distinct narratives. I'd need to do a 4th reread to know. In some ways, I think that's a big pro because you can read each book separately. Not everyone has the time or inclination to read a series back to back. Maybe you like a book that feels a bit separate and ends itself in a good way. But equally, it can be a bit confusing. I was looking back at my original review for The House of Sundering Flames, and I basically say, I really enjoyed this book. Couldn't remember anything the moment I put it down though. And that does feel true for this series. If you asked me to tell you exactly what happens, I could give you some big plot moments and some visuals that have really stuck in my mind, but I could not tell you beat for beat the story. I mean, that's in part because my brain was all over the place back then and I've never claimed to have a good memory, but equally I do think this is just one of those series that really benefits from both rereading and, when you do read it, taking it slow, and maybe finding someone to read it with you who you can kind of digest things with. Maybe that's something that's just me and my terrible memory. Maybe that's something that you keep in mind if you want to buy a book. Am I going to want to reread it? I think this series has a lot of rereadability, partly because I've forgotten everything that happened so it feels new again, but also you do get more out of it on a second read. If you aren't a big rereader and you are planning on reading this, I think my suggestion would be to maybe give yourself a crib sheet and just keep a vague note of who's who and who belongs to what house. I think it would help. I have a few things that I would maybe compare this to that I've read. I don't think I have anything that feels quite the same, but I wondered about Jade City by Fonda Lee, just for the importance of the city as part of the story. City of Lies by Sam Hawke is a fantasy mystery, and I really liked how various elements of that story come in quite late in the game, which is definitely something that happens with this series. And finally, I wondered about Chorus of Dragons series, just because I think that's a really good fantasy series, and I honestly can't remember why I wrote it in my notes as something to compare it to, but I've mentioned it now, so there you go. Should you read this series? I would say definitely yes for most people. It's not going to be for everyone, and I think that Aliette De Bodard's writing isn't everyone's cup of tea. I would say read book 1 and see how you feel about it, and if you like book 1, you will definitely like the other books, and if you're less sold on that, you might not want to bother. But as I say, if you do choose to read this, take it slow, keep an eye on who's who and what's what, and you will have a great time. And just enjoy that gloriously creepy setting. And if at the end of the book you're like, I have no idea what happened, then come tell me about it, because same. Comment below if you have any other atmospheric books you want me to read. I know I ask for that quite often, but I am always interested in more atmosphere in my life. While you're down there commenting, you can also subscribe because it makes me feel loved and appreciated. That's all from me, and I will see you in the next one. There's gonna be some bloopers now. Paris is divided into... I was looking back at my original review for The House of Sundering Flames.